pleasure to have Steve Ellner gracing our podium. Steve has been coming to World Fellowship for a very long time. When he first came, he wasn't a presenter. When he first came, he wasn't as tall as the podium. When he first came, I'm not sure if he was in diapers, but at the very least he was running around in short pants, enjoying World Fellowship for all the reasons that so many short people do. Over the years, he developed other ways to love World Fellowship and other ways to give back to World Fellowship. He eventually emigrated to Venezuela, where he's lived for the past 25 years. 40 years, the past 40 years, 25 of which he taught at the Universidad de Oriente, teaching political history. And particularly during the Chavez and Maduro years has been sought out as a commentator about the political situation, and has written pieces for In These Times, The Nation, has written op-ed pieces for the New York Times and the LA Times, and for NACLA Report on the Americas, and he's currently a managing editor for Latin American Perspectives Journal. His upcoming book is Latin America's Pink Tide, Breakthroughs and Shortcomings. And so it's a special pleasure and opportunity for us to have a speaker who's able to speak through a lens, not just of political economy, but from having experienced Venezuela through many different periods in daily life. So please give a warm welcome to our very own Steve Ellner.
Thank you, Randy. And after that story, whatever I say is going to be anticlimactic. No pun intended. I want to begin by talking about a tour that I gave in October, beginning of, I think September, October of last year, that is 2018, which began in Boston, as a matter of fact. And there was a solidarity group that invited me. I spoke at Boston University, and I stayed with a member of that organization, who was an activist in favor of, the cause of Venezuelan solidarity. And on the way to his house after I gave my talk, he said, "Your presentation was very good, but I'm not interested in what you had to say." And I was kind of surprised, being a member of the solidarity group for Venezuela, that he would say that. So I asked why. And his answer was, I think, something that is worth analyzing. He said that he's not interested in the details of Venezuela. He's not interested really in Venezuela at all, because all he has to know is that there are sanctions against Venezuela, and that sanctions that are not approved of, not ratified by the UN, are illegal, and that throughout history, the sanctions against Iraq, against Syria, against wherever those sanctions have been applied, have been unsuccessful and have caused great suffering for the people of those countries. So that he didn't really have to know anything else. He didn't have to know about what the politics, the internal politics are, what the Chavez stood for, what Maduro stands for. He didn't have to know any of that, because the sanctions are illegal, and the sanctions always cause suffering among the general population. And that statement had me thinking, and I analyzed it, and since then I've even made some comments about it in some of my articles. And that is that there are two approaches to Venezuelan solidarity. One is that these sanctions have always been unsuccessful from all viewpoints, in addition to being illegal. But there's a shortcoming with that approach. Its advantage is that it's very simple. You don't really have to detail, you don't have to know anything about Venezuela, you just have to talk about what sanctions mean in a general sense. But the disadvantage is, I would say two disadvantages. One is that, what about people who would say, I'm not really opposed to sanctions per se? I mean, after all, if there were sanctions against Pinochet, even if they weren't legal sanctions, even if they weren't sanctions ratified by the United Nations, I certainly would not be out on the streets demonstrating. I certainly wouldn't be giving solidarity talks, and I think most people would feel the same way. So that's a shortcoming with regard to that approach. And the other shortcoming is that what is happening in Venezuela is extremely important. If you try to convince people to write to your congresspeople or to participate in any action in opposition to solidarity, but you really believe, as I said just recently, Trump's statement that Maduro is a dictator, if you really believe that, then you're not going to be particularly enthusiastic about participating in any action. After all, there's so many courses out there that you'll choose another course. So that is important also, to understand why these sanctions are being imposed on Venezuela. What does Venezuela represent? And is Venezuela a dictatorship? Is Maduro a dictator? Or are there attractive aspects of the Chavista, I'll call it the Chavista experience, that is, Chavez being, Hugo Chavez when he was president until his death in 2013, and now Maduro, who is also a Chavista. So the Chavista experience has extremely attractive aspects in terms of the social programs, in terms of the democracy that's being proposed, the type of democracy that's being proposed, in terms of a lot of different aspects. And it kind of reminds me, and I think I might have said in that conversation in the car to that gentleman who told me that he wasn't interested in what I had to say. I said that, in the 1960s, the anti-war movement was successful, and partly why it was successful is that people were partly motivated by Ho Chi Minh. They were motivated by the image of Ho Chi Minh. And if you compare that with the Middle East, U.S. military intervention in the Middle East, and you compare Ho Chi Minh with the Taliban or with, any of the other heads of states, like in the case of Syria perhaps, that may explain in part why the anti-war movement today, in spite of the fact that the war in Afghanistan has lasted for, more than 15 years, and in spite of all the atrocities that have taken place and all the evidence of those atrocities, you don't have an anti-war movement like you had in the 1960s. So, convincing people that Venezuela is not, the Venezuelan government is not a dictator, convincing people that there are attractive aspects of what's happening in Venezuela in spite of all the economic difficulties, that is important, and that is something that the solidarity movement depends on. And it's not easy. The first approach of just saying that the sanctions are illegal and that the sanctions have always caused a lot of harm is an easy approach. It's almost too easy. The second approach is much more difficult because it's complicated. The situation in Venezuela is complicated. And it's partly complicated, the complication is even aggravated by the fact that the media conflates two elements that are essential. One is the economic situation, and they harp on that. The economic difficulties. They exaggerate. The Chavista people would say that they exaggerate and that they're lying. Some of the Chavista leaders would say, no, it's not that bad. Well, it is bad, even though they do exaggerate. But you have a country in which inflation is 1,000,000%. So that somebody who earns his salary on a fortnight basis, which most people earn, it's called quincena in Spanish, you get paid every 2 weeks. you have to spend that money in the first couple of days, because if you wait till the end of the quinzena, of the fortnight, the quinzena, the purchasing power is much less. So that in itself is part of the hardships that the Venezuelan people are going through, on a daily basis. But the media conflates that, the economic situation, which they blame the government completely for, and the state of Venezuelan democracy. And people, most people are not knowledgeable about what's happening in the world. It's certainly not a third world country. Most people don't have that much interest in third world countries. A lot of people know that the economic situation is very difficult. They might know somebody, a Venezuelan, in the States who talks about it. And so the narrative that inserts the message that Maduro is a dictator, that the government is authoritarian, that the government is fierce repression of the people who are demonstrating against the government. Those two messages get conflated. And the second message is just thrown out there. It's not as if they go into too much detail. They just throw it out. And so the people who aren't really analytical, they're just left with the impression, there are two things that are going on in Venezuela. Firstly, the people are suffering greatly. And secondly, this is a dictatorship. This is an authoritarian government. Well, the fact of the matter is that Maduro is not a dictator. And the fact of the matter is that the economic situation is much more complex than saying the government is solely responsible. I mean, that's what Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, said recently. We're talking about June of 2019, in which he was asked a question about the sanctions. And he said, no, that's not the problem in Venezuela. That's not what the suffering in Venezuela is all about. It's about the Venezuelan government. They're responsible. They're solely responsible for what's happening in Venezuela. And that statement is repeated over and over again by the Venezuelan opposition. And it's an issue that really has to be analyzed. Because the fact of the matter is that the sanctions, the argument of the opposition is, look, Trump comes along in 2016, he becomes president in 2017. So those sanctions began after the economic hardships began. The economic problems in Venezuela began, it had a lot to do with the 2008 crash, which affected the price of oil. Oil began declining, international prices nosedived, but they nosedived in August of 2014. So the opposition will say, it's not about the price of oil, because it's not about the sanctions, because the sanctions began in 2017. And it's not about the price of oil, because the oil prices declined sharply in mid-2014. But the economic problems preceded both of those factors. I argue, and I'm completely convinced, that there are three explanations, and they're not explanations, they're factors, and they're all important, that explain the economic problems of Venezuela. One is the price of oil. The Venezuelan economy has always, since the late 1920s, when it became the world's leading exporter of oil, it has always been dependent on oil prices. And historically, when the prices go up, everything's hunky-dory, and there's a high level of acceptance among the population for the president of the country. And when the opposite happens, when prices decline, people start criticizing. There are demonstrations, there are sometimes riots, as what happened in 1989. So that is an historical tendency. The fact that the economic problems preceded the decline in the price of oil, the fact of the matter is that prior to that, the situation wasn't that bad in Venezuela. There were problems, like there are in all countries, as a matter of fact. We have them here in the United States. But the problems intensified in the course of those years. So that the decline in the price of oil had a lot to do with the steady decline, which might have began a little bit before mid-2018, but that decline continued. The purchasing power of the Venezuelan population declined after that. The problem of hyperinflation really began around that time, so that the price of oil, the decline in the price of oil, had a lot to do with the problem. Now, the price of oil rose about a year in 2017, 2018. It began to recover, but it recovered just moderately. I mean, the price of oil reached $150 a barrel. And so the price of Venezuelan oil reached 30 some odd dollars, say $32, $35. So you imagine, from over $100 a barrel for Venezuelan oil to $32, $34, that's going to affect the economy in a big way. So it improved. It reached $50, $60. But the fact of the matter is that if you compare Maduro with Chavez, and very often that comparison is made because a lot of people who dislike Maduro, who say that Chavez was, you know, they're Chavistas, they like Chavez, they voted for Chavez, and they say, I'm not going to vote for Maduro, because Maduro isn't Chavez. But the fact of the matter is that when Chavez was president, the price of oil steadily increased, okay? So Chavez gets credit for the improvement in the standard of living of Venezuelans. Under Maduro, just the opposite happened. So in a situation like that, there are expectations, there are commitments, financial commitments that the government has as a result of the fact that the price of oil is above $100 a barrel. And when that declines, then that puts the government in bad light. So that's the first explanation. The second explanation is what I call the war on Venezuela. The Chavistas talk about the economic war, la guerra económica. But I prefer to just say war. Why do I say that? Because it goes way beyond economics. But the fact of the matter is that when the opposition says, look, those sanctions began under Trump, and when Trump became president in 2017, the economy was really bad. They leave out of the picture the fact that we're not only talking about sanctions. We're talking about an ongoing war of aggression against Venezuela. And that in the history of democracy, or let's say liberal democracy, in the history of liberal democracy, in the history of electoral democracy, so we're excluding, you know, the Soviet Union and even Cuba, democracies in which the heads of states are elected directly by the population. There isn't a country in the world that has faced such aggression by the opposition in Venezuela, which is a disloyal opposition meaning an opposition that doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the government, that employs legal, semi-legal, and illegal means to create instability and regime change. And that's been the case of Venezuela since almost the beginning of Chavez's period, when he was elected in 1998. By the year 2001, you had a general strike in December 10th, I think it was, 2001. And shortly after that, a general strike, which was really a lockout of the business sector of the population that closed their doors. So that's not a general strike, even though it was supported by the bigger trade union leaders, the historical trade union leaders. But it was basically a lockout. And that led into the coup against Chavez. So over these, 15 years, or more than 15 years, there's no comparison. There's no other country in the world, no other liberal democratic country in the world that has faced the kind of aggression to create instability and to achieve regime change. You had the coup against Chavez in April of 2002. Chavez was overthrown for 2 days. You had in Spanish, it's called paro petrolero, the oil strike, in which they shut down the oil industry completely. the country wasn't producing hardly any oil at all. As a result of that, it lasted 2 months. You've had violent demonstrations on the streets, going back to the early years of the Chavez period. And I remember seeing them in Caracas in 2007. I mean, Chavez had just been re-elected president in 2006, in December of 2006, with the highest percentage points of votes of any Venezuelan president in modern Venezuelan history. He got, how much was it, Michelle? 67%. He got 67% of the vote. And shortly after that, I remember I was in Caracas. I couldn't get, I hardly got to the place that I had to go to because of the violent demonstrations that took place just months after he was elected with such an overwhelming victory. And violent demonstrations in 2014 that lasted 4 months. Violent demonstrations in 2017 that also lasted 4 months. And then in between those two sets of protests, when Obama declared Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security. And that's another issue. The opposition would say, well, you know, that didn't mean anything. That was a joke. Of course Venezuela isn't a threat to U.S. national security. But the fact of the matter is that right after that, U.S. companies began to leave Venezuela. They shut down their operations and they left. Ford, Kimberly-Clark, and then later after that, General Motors, Kellogg's, and the list goes on. Because imagine a U.S. company, the CEO is a U.S. citizen, and the president of the country says Venezuela is a threat to U.S. national security, that's going to be motive enough to shut down operations in Venezuela and pull out. But in addition to that, and I was talking to Diane this morning about Cuba, that the sanctions against Venezuela by Obama, when he declared Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security, he created this list that Trump has built on, but it began under Obama. And it was a list of Venezuelans who were sanctioned. So the list of Venezuelan government officials who have been who are sanctioned, who can't travel to the United States, who have their millions of dollars in U.S. banks frozen. I don't think any Chavista would be that dumb to deposit their money in U.S. banks. But it began under Obama. And that affects investments in Venezuela. And Diana was talking about the case of Cuba, that, you know, now with Trump, there are restrictions on travel to Cuba, and a lot of people just assume that traveling to Cuba is illegal. And so that's affected the Cuban economy in a big way. So that happened under Obama. And just like so many other things, what Obama did, he created a gateway, or he opened the road to the intensification of measures that have been implemented by Trump. So that, you know, when the opposition says that's false, that the problems in Venezuela are due to the United States, that statement is misleading, because the opposition by the United States is not just the sanctions under Trump. Those sanctions go back. But not only do they go back to 2015 in the case of Obama, they go back to the early years of the Chavez government, when, for instance, the United States blocked the sale of parts to the F-16s, which were the flagship planes of the Venezuelan Air Force. They were bought, they were purchased in the early 1980s, and the United States refused to sell those parts, which meant that those planes could not be used by the Air Force, and Chavez had to go to the Soviet Union to purchase planes for the Air Force. So that is just one example of how these actions, but the other thing is that the general strike, the coup against Chavez, they were supported by the United States. And so to say that the United States didn't do anything to create the economic difficulties in Venezuela until Trump came along is highly deceptive. The third factor is the mistakes that have been made by Maduro. And I think that it's important to analyze those mistakes because we have to learn from them. And I'm going to go into that, I think, a little later on, but the one mistake that does have to do directly with economic policy is that there has been a wide disparity between the official prices that the government establishes for basic commodities and the open market, the black market or the open market price for those commodities, and the cost of production. And the most obvious example is gasoline. Gasoline in Venezuela is practically free. And so you have a situation in which the government is actually losing money because there's such a wide disparity between the prices and the cost of production, or the prices in Venezuela and the prices elsewhere. And that promotes or encourages contraband. Because if you have products that are sold at an artificially low price, much lower than the prices in Colombia, you'll have a black market flow of goods from Venezuela to Colombia. And that's exactly what's taking place. But the worst aspect of that situation is something that I'm kind of hesitant to go into much detail because it's kind of hard for us in the United States to really understand what exchange rate system is all about. If you have a system which really goes back to 1983, so it wasn't Chavez who invented this, but Chavez reestablished a system in which you have an official rate, exchange rate, for basically for people who are importing items in order to avoid inflation, so that importers can purchase dollars from the Venezuelan government at an artificially low price, and then they can purchase the commodities. And so you have a second tier, which is the black market price. People need dollars. For instance, tourists need dollars. Well, they could, during a certain period of time, purchase those dollars at an artificially low price also, but there was a limit. So that in any case, anybody who wanted to purchase dollars, they had to go to the black market. And under Chavez, as long as you had a ratio of basically 2-to-1, in other words, the official price of dollars was, for most of that period, a little over 4 bolívares to the dollar, and the black market rate for the dollar fluctuated between $8 and $9. So you had basically a 2-to-1 ratio. That was manageable. It wasn't good, but it was manageable. But under Maduro, that has gotten out of hand completely. And within a short period of time, you had a situation in which the black market rate for the dollar was, 10 times more, 15 times more, 50 times more. So that in a situation like that, it's an invitation to corruption, because the people who are managing, the functionaries and the banks who are managing the sale of those so-called preferential dollars at an artificially low price, there's a great temptation for them to sell those dollars to people who say that they're importing commodities, but really aren't. And so you'll have ships that come in that are really don't have commodities on them, or really containers that don't have anything inside them. And so that kind of operation took place in a big way. Now the anti-Chavistas, the opposition, would say that those are the Chavistas who are responsible for that corruption. That's not true, and there are serious studies, one by Enrique Galasut, another by Curcio, Pascalina Curcio, two very, very serious people. Curcio is a professor, an economist at the Universidad Simón Bolívar, which is an elite university in Venezuela. It's public, but it's elite. And they have done empirical studies that demonstrate that a large number of cases of corruption, those dollars have gone to multinational corporations. That multinational corporations are responsible, and it shouldn't be surprising, because they have experience in those kinds of operations, and they have an international network, so they can, phony up their books, and they can import items from their subsidiaries in other countries. And so they're all prepared. They have an infrastructure in order to take advantage of that situation. But so, to sum up, there are three factors that explain the economic difficulties today. And to say that it's all about Chavez, all about Maduro, vertical lane is extremely misleading, and it takes these issues out of context. Because even the mistakes that have been made as a result of this, what I'm calling the war on Venezuela, an opposition which has really never recognized the legitimacy of the Chavez government. They did in the first couple of years, but by 2001, they ceased to do that. And 2001 was precisely, I'm talking about the late 2001, precisely when this process of change, which is a term that the Chavistas use, el proceso de cambio, got radicalized. Prior to that, it was really more about democracy, the new constitution that was ratified in 1999, and Venezuelan sovereignty, and participatory democracy. But in late 2001, in October 2001, Chavez passed 49 laws simultaneously, and one of them was the oil law. It was called La Ley Orgánica de Hidrocarburos, which renationalized the Venezuelan oil industry. The Venezuelan oil industry was being privatized during the neoliberal period of the 1990s, and under that law, the law stipulated that all mixed companies of private capital and state capital, had to be owned by the state had to own more than 50% of those companies, and then later we increased that to 60%. So that explains why the opposition, right at that time, started calling for the ouster of Chavez. Late 2001, there was a general strike that was called, and then another one in April that led into the coup against Chavez. So that the context has to be brought into the picture. So let's fast track to the situation under Maduro. What are these sanctions? What do these sanctions consist of? Firstly, the sanctions stipulated that the Venezuelan oil company Citgo could not repatriate its profits. In other words, it couldn't send its profits back to Venezuela. Citgo is really the largest chain of telecommunications in the United States. It's 100% owned by the Venezuelan government. That also goes back to the 1980s. And it had been remitting $1 billion per year. So Venezuela was deprived of $1 billion a year as a result of those sanctions. It also stated that the public debt, that bonds could not be sold. So that basically Venezuela could not refinance its public debt. Now that's something that any country is going to do in a difficult economic situation, and by the time those sanctions were imposed in August of 2017, the economic situation had gotten quite worse. And so any country in a economic situation with a big public debt is going to do the same thing. Well, Venezuela was really deprived of the ability to do that. They couldn't sell bonds in order to refinance its public debt. And the other thing is that every time Maduro reacted to those sanctions with measures of his own in order to find a way out of the economic difficulties, Trump would respond with new sanctions. So that in order to get around the fact that Venezuela could not deal in dollars, that the transactions were blocked, transactions in dollars were blocked, Maduro initiated a cryptocurrency called the petro. It was backed by oil, barrels of oil. And so that looked like it was getting off the ground when Trump declared that no U.S. citizen and nobody living in the United States could have transactions in the petro. So, I mean, that really shot the possibility that the Venezuelan government would establish its own system to allow it to facilitate international transactions. When the government began to develop gold, there's a vast quantity of gold in the southern part, south of the Orinoco region, which Chavez was beginning to develop. It's called the Arco Minero del Orinoco. And it was a big project that Chavez got off the ground in the latter part of his period as president. And Maduro began developing that as a way to substitute the problems that he was having selling oil. And immediately Trump decreed that basically transactions in gold were prohibited. So that this has been an ongoing kind of situation. Each time the Venezuelan government initiates something, the U.S. government reacts to block that initiative. But the really damaging aspect of these sanctions, I mentioned before that U.S. companies and other companies have hesitated to have anything to do with Venezuela. And it's gotten so bad that really what's called sanctions or an embargo, it's really a blockade. A blockade meaning that the country can't get anything out and can't get anything in. There's no transaction. And it's really coming to that in an absolute kind of way. Because the U.S. government has played an activist role. I mean, this is really without precedent. That a U.S. government would travel throughout the world, would try to convince other governments and other companies and threaten other companies throughout the world, multinational companies, if they didn't follow the policies that have been dictated by the United States in terms of sanctions. So these sanctions are not just sanctions involving U.S. companies. Well, you know, the Cubans know all about that because that goes back to the war on Cuba. But I think that most people in the United States weren't aware of that until recently with Iran. Iran is getting a lot more publicity. The sanctions against Iran are getting a lot more publicity. People really don't know about Venezuela. People really don't know what the sanctions are causing in Venezuela. I mean, all they hear about is that there's a list of so many Venezuelans, I don't know how many, maybe 80 Venezuelans. How many?
100.
So it's going up. Over 100 Venezuelans who are connected with the government or connected with the governing party who are being sanctioned, which means that they can't have money in the United States, which I'm sure none of them do, and they can't travel to the United States. And so the kind of information that people are getting here in the United States is that, well, okay, these are corrupt people, these are people involved in drug laundering, drug trafficking. That's the accusation, without any right of replica, without any judicial process in which these people can defend themselves. This is just a decree, the list of people who are being sanctioned. You want to say something?
There's no evidence.
Without any evidence. That's right. Without any evidence even. I mean, it's bad enough that these Venezuelan officials don't have the right to defend themselves, but they're not even, they're not even being accused. There's no formal, accusation. There's no explanation for why they're being sanctioned. So that in the United States, people just assume the war on Venezuela, the economic war in Venezuela, which is a term that the Chavistas use, consists of, bad luck for these 100-odd Venezuelans who can't travel to the United States. But the fact of the matter is that Stephen Mnuchin and other members of the Trump administration, but especially Stephen Mnuchin, has used that list of sanctions in order to intimidate companies throughout the world. He has called workshops of representatives of Asia, Europe, Latin America, because he says practically, I'm not gonna go to sleep until I find out what the companies are that Nicolas Maduro has investments in order to freeze those investments. He's going after Maduro, and Maduro supposedly has investments in companies throughout the world. But the fact of the matter is that nobody knows what those companies are. And him just saying that means that companies throughout the world are afraid to have anything to do with Venezuela. Because if it turns out that Maduro has, stock in that company, which is absurd, but if it turns out that he did, then their money would be frozen. So this is more than just sanctions. This is a blockade against Venezuela. And more recently, it's gotten a lot worse. Ever since the US government has recognized the shadow government, or the parallel government of Juan Guaido on January 23rd of this year, that is 2019, the representatives of the Trump administration have attempted to convince India, for instance, not to buy oil from Venezuela. And this relates to what I said before. Each time there's a new initiative on the part of Venezuela, the United States attempts to block that initiative. Venezuela, as a result of not being able to sell oil to the United States, so the plan was to increase the sale of oil to India. And they were selling 300,000 barrels a day to India. That went down to 200,000 barrels a day, and the United States stated publicly, members of the Trump administration stated publicly, that they are in conversation with the government of India in order to not purchase oil from Venezuela. So that these sanctions go way beyond just the list of people who are being sanctioned. They mean, in effect, that companies throughout the world are not dealing with Venezuela, they're not investing in Venezuela, they're not purchasing products from Venezuela, and they're not selling products to Venezuela out of fear. In the case of example, Iran is getting a lot of publicity that Venezuela should get also with regard to these sanctions. And I believe that it has a lot to do with the fact, politics. The agreement with Iran was an initiative of Obama, who was a Democratic president. And so that politicizes Trump's decision to rescind that deal and to reestablish the sanctions against Iran. And this time, Europe, which had signed the agreement, because it wasn't just between the United States and Iran, Europe is opposed to the sanctions against Iran. Europe has been humiliated by this situation, because Europe has been unable to do anything about those sanctions, and European companies have agreed to abide by the sanctions, so that Shell is not buying oil from Iran. Total in France is not buying oil from Iran. SWIFT, the financial institution, is not having transactions with banking transactions with Iran, so that it's putting Europe in a situation of impotence with regard to a policy that they oppose, but they can't do anything about. But the same thing that is going on with regard to Iran is also going on with regard to Venezuela. It's the same policy, it's the same playbook. Okay, I said to somebody that there's so much to talk about, that really it's all about having the discipline, which I don't have as a university professor, to try to hit the main points and not enter into too much detail. Because I realize that there's one issue, one topic that I should discuss, because I'm sure that people are interested, and that is what I said at the very beginning, that part of the problem is the errors that have been made by the governments. And I say governments because I'm referring to Chavez and I'm referring to Maduro. And that's important to point out, because, as I said before, there are a lot of people who call themselves Chavistas who continue to laud Chavez, but they say that Maduro is undoing all the good things that Chavez did. but not only in the camp of the left, because in the opposition also, you have a situation that for pragmatic reasons, sectors of the opposition are saying the same thing. And even Guaido, who represents the radical opposition, at one point made a statement about that Maduro is not doing what Chavez did.
So even Elliot Abrams said that.
Elliot Abrams said that, but Guaido also said that, and he was criticized by the people who are even more radical. When I say radical, it could be left or right, in this case it's right. And that's something that I also wanted to point out before we get into the errors, the topical errors. The Venezuelan opposition is divided. That shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, there are a lot of parties involved in the opposition, and it's certainly understandable that you'll have divisions. There's a radical fringe, and there are other parties that are well-established parties. One of them is the largest party historically in Venezuela. In fact, the two largest parties historically in Venezuela, COPE and Democratic Action, AD, don't support what Guaido is doing. COPE is not supporting what Guaido is doing. The position of what I'll call the moderates, and I say that because I'm referring to politics, but not economics, because the entire opposition, almost without exception, is neoliberal. So on economic policy, there might be some differences, but they all have that in common. They're all supporting neoliberal strategies. But politically, there are distinctions. And the people I'm calling moderate, COPE, for instance, and others, are opposed to, for instance, calling for military intervention. Eduardo Fernandez, who was one of the main political leaders in Venezuela for a long time, he was a presidential candidate in 1988, and Claudio Fermin, who was another presidential candidate in 93. They're very critical of the opposition. They say, let's negotiate with the government, and let's try to find a way out of the economic and political problems that the country is facing. But the radicals in the opposition, they call for military intervention. Maria Corina Machado, who is the most radical of them all, says the only way we can get rid of Maduro is through a military intervention. And she says, it's up to the United States. Basically, she says, it's up to the United States to get rid of Maduro. The other radical leaders call for military intervention. Antonio Ledesma calls it a humanitarian intervention. He says a military intervention will be a humanitarian intervention. His words. Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, who comes off as a politician. I mean, it's incredible that he's Secretary General of a multilateral organization. I mean, he speaks like a politician who's in the radical fringe in Venezuela. And he says that a military intervention in Venezuela would not be illegal by international law. Another leading member of the opposition, Diego Arias, says that a military intervention in Venezuela would have the support of the Venezuelan people. So that's the radical fringe. But there's another sector of the opposition that isn't in agreement with that. And they're not in agreement for that for pragmatic reasons. And being pragmatists, they favor making a distinction between Chavez and Maduro. They say Chavez was good, he did a lot of interesting things, and they say that if they return to power, they will continue some of the policies that Chavez implemented. Enrique Capriles, who was the presidential candidate for the opposition twice, first against Chavez and then against Maduro, I mean, he stated that, he said that the social programs were good in Venezuela, and that he would be even more effective in carrying out these social programs. What did he say? He was going to be more effective because he said, I'm going to even allow Cuban doctors who in Venezuela were involved in a very important program. It's called Misión Barrio Dentro, in which there are 20 to 30,000 Cuban doctors in the barrios, mostly in the barrios of Venezuela, setting up shop and clinics throughout Venezuela. And I'm such a nice guy that I'm going to offer them Venezuelan citizenship. Just think about that. I mean, he's going to be more effective in carrying out these social programs. Do you think the Cuban government would be that foolish, thinking that their doctors will end up becoming Venezuelan citizens? I mean, obviously, that would sabotage the whole program of the internationalists, the Cuban doctors who come to Venezuela. So that, but the discourse changed. The discourse was Chavez is successful in certain things, and that success should be recognized. Why does the so-called moderates, why do the so-called moderates say that? They say that because they realize how popular Chavez is, how popular Chavez was, and how popular he still is. And secondly, in order to drive a wedge in the Chavista movement, among those Chavistas who were dissatisfied with Maduro, but considered Chavez to be practically the savior for Venezuela. So there's a pragmatic strategy behind that. But the radicals of the opposition, or the radical neoliberals, and their narrative is it really all began with Chavez. Chavez is to blame because Chavez created a state that intervened in the economy. He nationalized strategic sectors of the economy. He nationalized 400 companies altogether were taken over by the government. And so for the radicals in the opposition, that can't be forgotten about. That has to be harped on. And so they say that the problems that Venezuela is facing today is the result of those policies that were initiated by Chavez. And, okay, so in addition to the point that I made before, that one of the mistakes that has been made is that the government has not recognized the importance of the market in Venezuela by allowing this big disparity between the official price of the dollar and the black market price of the dollar. By selling gasoline at such a low rate that you have widespread smuggling of gasoline into Colombia, but also a waste, because, you know, gasoline in other countries is almost like gold, and people don't waste it. In Venezuela they do, because it's so cheap. But in addition to that, the country's losing a lot of money, because they're not, what they collect for the sale of gasoline doesn't cover the cost of production. So the first error that I believe that the government has made, and I certainly welcome other people to hear their opinion about this, but in my opinion, there is a debate among Marxists, and specifically Marxist economists, about the marketplace. Some Marxists will say that the market is specific to capitalism. Others talk about market socialism and say that the marketplace is not incompatible with the socialist system. So that's an issue that is being discussed, and it's an important one, but I think it's important to keep in mind that Venezuela is not a socialist country. 80% of the economy, between 70 and 80% of the economy is capitalist. In a capitalist country, you can't ignore the marketplace. And I think that Maduro, I think probably, I'll throw this out as a possibility, he's a leftist, an activist from his days as a high school student, and he's got a sort of dogmatic mindset, and he doesn't appreciate the importance of the market. And as a result, for instance, electricity service and telephone service have declined significantly. Both those companies were nationalized by Chavez. They had been, the telephone company had been privatized previously, and he renationalized it. Electricity was always private. He nationalized it. But we have a situation in which the price of the monthly fee of the telephone, which I pay on internet while I'm here in the States, it's nothing. Somebody was offered to pay for the electricity in my house. And I said, no, don't need it. I'll pay on internet. And I paid converted from bolivares to dollars, it's like that, it's like 25 cents. So, I mean, obviously, this service is going to deteriorate as a result of the fact that the telephone company doesn't have the budget in order to provide a decent service. So that's one mistake. Two, and this does go back to Chavez, that you have a situation in which the concept of, it's a Marxist concept of totality. Marxists believe, and I'm a Marxist and I believe this, that you can't divide economics and politics and sociology in separate categories. It's all part of the same system. But I think that has something to do with some of the problems that is occurring. The government under Chavez and committed errors, made errors along these lines that I think has continued under Maduro. So the party that Chavez created in 2007 is the PSUV. And he never made a distinction between the party and the state. After all, if you have this concept of totality, then the party and the state, it's all part of the same entity. He was the president of the party, that's okay. But the president of the country is the president of the party. We had that in Europe as well. And some countries like Spain, when the socialists are in the government, the socialist is also the president of the party. But all the vice presidents, there were like 15, 17 vice presidents, and they were all ministers or governors. And at the state level, in those states in which the governor was a Chavista, the party was run by that governor. And the same thing with the municipal level. Accountability is important. And the Chavista slogan was people's accountability. So the idea was that you have rank and file input, social movements would have an input to monitor what the state was doing. But that isn't something that's going to be effective overnight. And it seems to me that if the party is tied to the state, if the people who are running the party are also ministers, that party is not going to be in a position to be critical. And certainly the problem of corruption. If you have ministers that are running the party, that party is probably not going to act in a big way against corruption. So I think that's a second mistake of the, going back to Chavez, that Maduro has continued. So that I think that the Venezuelan experience is a very rich experience, and it's important to analyze, critically analyze, what this experience has been all about. There are some people, and I know this, from the solidarity work, and I know this actually from way back even before the sanctions, that there's some people who are critical of anybody who's critical of the Venezuelan government. I have been criticized for that. And the argument is that, you're a gringo, and, let the Venezuelans analyze their own, and your work is to provide solidarity for Venezuela, nothing else. I'm not in agreement with that, because I think that it all depends on how you criticize. I mean, some people are very arrogant, whether you're on the left or the right, that's a different story. But I think that this experience in particular is important to analyze because it's unique, as I said before. A country with a liberal democratic tradition, an electoral country in which the president and the National Assembly and the whole system is based on elections, that the left has been in power for such an extended period of time. There is no example of that. With Cuba, Soviet Union, China, we're talking about a different story. But in other cases, like Allende, he was in power for only 3 years, and he was in a state of siege during those 3 years. In the case of Venezuela, it's different. And this gets me into the last thing that I want to say, which is my other criticism of the Chavista leadership. That is, it seems to me that right now, Maduro, there's little that Maduro can do. The idea of moving the revolution forward, some of the Trotskyist organizations criticize Maduro because things are at a standstill. Maduro is up against the wall. And in a situation like that, you really can't expect progress. But there are moments under Chavez and under Maduro in which the government had the upper hand. And it seems to me that the lesson is that when you have the upper hand, you can't just sit back. You can't just assume that the opposition is going to be a good guy and will respect you because you're respecting them. You've got to act. That's the only time that you really can act. When Chavez had the upper hand after he was reelected, I mentioned before, in 2006, he was elected with 64%, with 63% of the vote. He did act. He nationalized strategic sectors of the economy, electricity, banking, the cement company, and other companies were nationalized. He created the PSUV, which was an important initiative, a mass-based party. He carried out other policies. He, for instance, he didn't renew the license of the TV channel that had basically declared war on Chavez. They interviewed an insurgent general who called for the overthrow of the government and transmitted that. It wasn't live. It was in a clandestine hiding place. So there were reasons to do that, and it was a blow against the opposition. So he did act. But it seems to me that in addition to those initiatives, there's something else he could have done, and that was to move in a big way against bureaucracy and against corruption, which he also did, by the way, but not enough. And the same thing with Maduro. Maduro had moments in which he could have taken initiatives. For instance, he was elected president in April with just 1.5% of the vote difference, but then that December, I'm talking about April 2013, in December of 2013, they held municipal elections. The opposition said, aha, these elections are going to be a plebiscite. We're going to show that Maduro is not popular. And the Chavistas won with 11.5% of the vote, 11.5% difference of the vote. It was a resounding victory for the Chavistas. That was the moment to act. And then when the protests, the violent protests took place later in 2014, that was also the time to act. Those protests were defeated, and the opposition was demoralized. So, and Maduro didn't take advantage of that. In fact, as a matter of fact, he announced a shakeup. He called it El Gran Sacudón, a major shakeup of his administration. And he created great expectations in Venezuela. He announced that he was going to announce that, and then he put off that announcement for a month, and then he put it off again. And when he finally announced it, I remember I was with my wife watching on TV, and we said, my God, you know, it's musical chairs. Ministers going from one ministry to another. And with just one exception, the petroleum minister, there really wasn't any change at all, or any significant change. So that's another criticism. And I'll end by just saying this with regard to that criticism. When Chavez died, the Foro de Sao Paulo, probably heard of the Sao Paulo Forum of leftist parties and organizations in Latin America, they met in Venezuela. They met in Caracas in honor of Chavez. And Álvaro García Linera was one of the people, the vice president of the Evo Morales government of Bolivia. And sitting and looking at Maduro in the eyes, he said, the one thing that we've learned is that a process of change, a revolutionary process of change, that doesn't progress, that stays standstill, is going to be defeated. And so that advice, I don't think Maduro really took that seriously, because it was right around that period in which there was a lot that he could have done, and he didn't take advantage of that particular moment. So I think these are some of the lessons that we've learned, or at least we should talk about, and that's why I don't believe that talking about and criticizing what's happening in Venezuela should be taboo. It should be open to discussion.